My name is Carlos Martinez, the Executive Director of the Latino Community Foundation of Colorado, an initiative of Rose Community Foundation. As I had mentioned a little bit earlier, our second panel is really about putting a voice and a face to immigrants and refugees and what's happening right now at the local level. I'm very excited to have our panelists here this morning. I know of their work very, very well because our foundation funds all three of these organizations. And it's great to be able to have folks who can be with us today, who can really share that that not only that perspective of what's going on within their organization, but their personal perspective as well. So to my immediate, we're going to get going on this. To my immediate left is Sandra Hernandez, who's the Executive Director of Centro de la Familia in Colorado Springs. Next to her is Nicole Malacu, who's the Executive Director of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, which is a statewide organization. And next to her is Michaela Goring, Executive Director from the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. So all three of these individuals work with immigrants and refugees. And we're going to start off with Sandra first to give us a little overview perspective of the work that you're doing and how has your work changed in the last 6 months?
Absolutely. Well, let me, first of all, I want to thank your staff, or all the people that have been a part of this, have been so graceful since I've been here. In fact, I was on the end of the bathroom line and I was pushed up to the front. It's never happened in my lifetime, so thank you to all of you. Let me just say this. I am of Puerto Rican heritage, so those of us who were born in Puerto Rico are born with United States citizenship. That's just something that kind of happened. And so when we migrated to the United States, as my parents did back around World War II, they kind of had at least a bronze spoon in their mouths. It's not silver, surely not gold, because they were educated to some degree, okay, high school. And a little bit more of maybe first 2 years of college. And so they were able to go ahead and provide to us, me and my 3 siblings, a lifestyle that allowed us to actually get educated. I came to Colorado Springs about 1976. I thought this was heaven, the most beautiful place I'd ever seen in my life, even compared to the island of Puerto Rico. So I've lived here 40 years. And I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so I worked at different places. And in 1996, I was in private practice, and the Center for the Prevention of Domestic Violence had asked me at that time if I was willing to do some pro bono work. There was a lot of an influx of women who were in domestic violence situations, and there was no bilingual, bicultural counselors to provide mental health counseling for them and for their children. So I said, sure, why not? I'm doing well, and I believe there is a responsibility to give back. Those of us who have must give back. And so I went ahead and said, sure, why not? Well, one client became 2, 2 became 20, 20 became 26, and before I realized it, my waiting room was full of undocumented women and their children who were basically dealing with the post-traumatic stress syndrome that they have to experience when they actually are victims of domestic violence. So what I came to the conclusion with my partner at that time is that there was a real need to serve this population. And so we went ahead and we started a 501c3, which was Centro de la Familia back in 1996. So we've been in existence now for 21 years. Most recently, we have served 1,700 clients, a combination of kids and women, lots of women and even men and children also. So we're a mental health center. Even though we initially started to provide just domestic violence counseling, we saw the need to go ahead and broaden the mental health aspect. So we treat all kinds of different diagnoses, whether it's depression, anxiety, PTSD. We have kids who are dealing with the different autism and Asperger's that are prevalent in many of our youngsters. We also saw a need for advocacy. Many of our clients have to deal with landlords who are not treating them correctly. Sometimes they need our help in the schools also to intervene at times. Our parents don't know that their children with special needs maybe need and can have a right to an individualized education plan. And so we are pretty established in Colorado Springs. We're called the Safe Haven. The kids come to Centro and they say, "Ah, mira la casita. We want to." They don't want to leave. Parents have to drag them out. We make it very friendly for them. We're very respectful of them. One of the things that gravitated, I guess, me to commit 21 years of my life, because I'm going to retire in about 6 months, was that I really fell in love with this population. I mean, they come here with nothing, absolutely nothing, to work, to get a job. And that's the thing that they want to do. And many of them are single men who have their families over there. And once they get established, then they bring their children here. Some of them are single women also who come with no very low level of educations, maybe third, fourth grade, if at that, seeking jobs. When we first started Centro de la Familia, jobs were aplenty. People could thrive, people could do very well. There was a hitch in 2006, as was mentioned by our keynote speaker, when some of that legislation that Denver decided to go ahead and be forward on. But things settled down. But this last 6 months has been awful for our families, I think, as was alluded to. We have kids coming in with anxiety and depression. They go to school fearful that when they get back, their parents are not going to be there. The parents are hesitating to go anywhere. They will take the kids. What we've seen is that they will take the kids to school. But as far as any extracurricular activities during the weekends, it's like they're in a concentration camp, these kids. They don't let them go outside. They don't take them to the different parks and community activities that they used to before. So we've got kids who are suffering from anxiety, depression. It almost feels, when they tell me these stories, and I think a tear came to your eye, and a tear came to my eye when I remember the first family who came to me and they said, "We do nothing. We go to school and that's it." It's so different than what it used to be for us before. Felt like a Nazi concentration camp is what the feelings came to me at that time. We are committed to providing the services to these kids and their family members at no cost. We were lucky to get a grant from the Colorado Springs Health Foundation to hire a therapist to do that kind of work, but we would have done it anyway. We have never turned away a client. Most of our services are free, thanks to the generosity of an organization like you. Now, one of the things that I get amazed at is that with all the anti-immigrant feeling, we have gotten quite a lot of money from foundations, be they from the government, be they from private foundations, maybe one or two that haven't. But for the most part, they've been very supportive of the work that we do. And I'm grateful for that, and our families are very grateful for that. And I'm hoping that those foundations are going to continue to provide that kind of support for us in the future. The thought that I have for the rest of you is that we always need private foundations. So if you are familiar with the GIVE campaign that occurs every year around October, if you see Centro de la Familia's name there, we would love to have you donate to us. So muchas gracias.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sandra. Nicole.
So my name is Nicole Malacu. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. Thanks for having us here today. We represent 64 organizations across the state, and so they could be organizations from faith, labor, community-based organizations, as well as grassroots organizations who are working to improve lives of immigrants across Colorado. We do most of our work through policy, advocacy, leadership development, and civic engagement. And so a lot of the work that Mr. Chisti talked about earlier was really the result of grassroots organizing and leadership across the state to really push back on anti-immigrant policies back in 2010 when we saw Senate Bill 90 introduced here in Colorado. In 2013, CIRC and our members were critical in repealing that law and passing the Community Trust and Safety Act, which really dismantled all of the Show Me Your Papers element of that law and really worked with sheriff departments across the state to say, like, we don't want our county dollars or our municipal dollars to be spent enforcing immigration laws. And so we've done extensive work throughout the state with rural and urban communities alike to be able to have all 64 sheriffs signed on board right now to not enforce immigration law and to not honor ICE holds unless there is a warrant from an immigration judge that really would then indicate some sort of deep criminal sort of offense that would warrant somebody being held beyond, you know, the typical 24-hour hold. A lot of our work right now, post-election, has really focused on rapid response, and so Michaela Remain is one of our members, but we've just had an unprecedented level of different stakeholder tables that have come together to build response post-election. There's a lot of folks working right now on the Sanctuary City debate, which at the heart of the matter is really about safe cities and creating spaces where we are able to really say that all community members are safe, regardless of folks' immigration status. We're working with the city of Boulder to work at the county level then, so in addition to the municipal level policies we can pass, we're really working at the county level across the board. And in Longmont, we're having a similar discussion. And one of the parts that comes up so frequently for us in our work is the sort of idea of, you know, the myth of immigrants as criminals. And I think one of the discourse pieces for a lot of folks is that, you know, crimes are committed by immigrants, and sort of the national discourse has lifted up two extreme cases where there were, you know, folks who committed crimes in big cities, which were labeled sanctuary cities at the time. And I think this brings to heart, like, the issue of, like, you know, categorizing people, good or bad immigrant, on the basis of a civil offense. So an overstay of a visa is not a criminal offense, it's a civil offense. And so when we look at the 163,000 estimated undocumented folks across our state, as our other panelists have said, we're talking about people who want to work, live, contribute to their communities, help be a part of their municipal fabric in a way that you know, contributes to society overall. And so I think the discourse and sort of the good versus bad immigrant has really been lifted up as a result of the national discussion. But here in Colorado, I think the values of folks really being welcoming and inclusive and spaces where people can carve out a life for themselves and their families need to sort of bubble up and rise to the top as we continue this discussion. The other part of our work that's been really great right now, one of the silver linings, is that we have an unprecedented amount of you know, stakeholders and allies who are coming forward and wanting to really support our work. And so there's a particular role for them in you know, the immigrant advocacy domain, and that is really holding our leaders and our congressional delegation accountable to, like, not vote for you know, certain enforcement measures that are sort of floating to the top of the current environment, and really wanting people to see the value that immigrants contribute to Colorado.
Thank you, Nicole. Michaela?
Well, I also want to echo everyone's thanks for being here. I feel like it is such an honor to be here, and I was so inspired by Mr. Chisti's keynote address, and just a reminder of the history that our country has been in and the moment in history that we are now. It's very inspirational to see all of you here. And I do, you know, I think, like Nicole said, the silver lining of this is that there is a community of advocates and people who care about these issues coming together to fight back. And we've seen that, and it is a seed of hope and some inspiration, and I think what is otherwise a really challenging time. So as Carlos mentioned, my name is Michaela Goring, and I'm the executive director of a nonprofit organization in town called the Rocky Mountain Immigrant Advocacy Network. The acronym is extremely tricky. It's REMAIN. One of Mr. Chisti's colleagues, Hiroshi, actually is responsible for that misspelling, so I blame him. But we exist because we're helping people to remain here in the United States. So our organization is primarily a legal services organization. We're an office that is primarily made up of lawyers, as well as we're really fortunate. Hearing Sandra talk makes me remember how important social workers are, and we've recently been able to add a couple of social workers to our staff, which has become all the more important in these times. So the work that Remain does really centers on two very vulnerable immigrant populations in Colorado. The first is children. So, and the second population is people who are at the Immigration Detention Center. So I'll talk just a little bit about our children's program, and then I'm going to spend a little bit more of my introduction talking about immigration detention, because based on executive actions that have been taken by this administration and directives that have come down from the Department of Homeland Security, those are really the changes that we're anticipating and that we've already started to see change in enforcement and expansion of detention. So I'll spend a little bit more time talking about that. But I think the first thing that I want to start out with and just really emphasize to this group, and I think a theme that has been throughout our keynote and all the really inspirational panelists who were before me too, is rule of law. And it's such an interesting time to be a lawyer, because lawyers are usually the most reviled. And it's been, for the first time ever, I feel like lawyers and the legal community have just gotten this huge, it just feels so wonderful to be an attorney. All the bad lawyer jokes are sort of out. And really, I mean, you know, as we saw with the travel ban that came down and the response from attorneys who showed up at airports around the country, including here at DIA, a number of our staff were there and members of CERC. You know, lawyers really are the first responders, and I think it also just speaks to the power. I still have a lot of faith in our democracy and our Constitution, because we are seeing the rule of law hold up to pieces that we do. But what Remain does is provide attorneys to people who otherwise would have no access to an attorney. And I think one of the shocking things that this is such a highly educated and informed group, you probably already know this, but one of the more shocking things I think that exists in the U.S. legal system is the fact that there is no right to appointed counsel for people who are going through removal proceedings. And that means that kids who are as young as 3 or 4 years old have to be before an immigration judge with an attorney from Immigration and Customs Enforcement as opposing counsel. And if they don't have the resources to hire a private attorney, and if there's not a nonprofit attorney that can step in, they are on their own. Same thing for people who are in immigration detention. So people who are facing linguistic and cultural barriers, who are separated from all the documentation that they need to present their cases, a lot of times don't have contact with family members because they're in detention and people are very fearful to visit the detention center, also are expected to navigate an incredibly complex area of the law. Immigration law has been compared to the U.S. tax code in terms of complexity, but are forced to present their cases in those contexts. And, you know, I think we all know how grave the consequences can be for people who are in removal proceedings. Sort of tapping into the historical note of this, there was a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court in 1922 that said deportation or removal proceedings have grave consequences, including removal to a country where an individual may face harm or even death, separation and banishment from family, friends, and community, loss of livelihood, property, or all that makes life worth living. And it's incredible that with all of the attributes that the U.S. legal system has, this is a context in which, because these proceedings are considered civil in nature, we don't provide attorneys in this context, despite the fact that the decisions that the immigration judges are making are, and many times for many of the asylum seekers that we're representing, are literally matters of life and death. So that's really where Remain exists, to step in and provide due process and support and access to counsel. So we have an amazing staff, a small staff, but an amazing staff of 9 attorneys that work both with our detention program and our kids program. And then really the strength of our program is in the legal community and in the pro bono attorneys who literally come from all walks of life and who have maybe no experience in immigration law, but really courageously come forward and learn this area of law and represent clients in their cases. So I'll spend just...
Well, you know, I'll get back to you because I have a question on what you're going to go in there. So I'll just hold it for a minute, okay? So Sandra, I'm going to go back to you for a minute right now. Yes. So when you talk about the trauma, the fear that children go through, that mothers go through, Can you just talk a little bit more about kind of like what goes on in the household when all this is happening, and how is it that families try and stay together and keep it together? Because it's just, I just can't imagine that.
Well, you've got to realize that we have a lot of single moms with children, but we also have intact families also. So these are parents that are working sometimes 2 jobs,
Right.
okay, just to try to make ends meet. So, I mean, they're tired, okay, they're stressed. Sometimes they become irritable just because of feeling tired. Now you have to have the fact that they could be removed from their home. That any time anybody could go ahead and come to their home, or when they're driving. There's a lot of caution about driving. Many of these people don't have licenses because that whole system that was going to happen somehow got delayed. I'm not sure what happened with that. You probably have a good idea. And so we have another level of stress. Immigrant families are stressed enough as it is. Now you add the layer of the fact that they might be removed, as you were saying, which means that they lose everything that they have to a country that they may not have any knowledge about, particularly if they're young children, and that they're scared. They don't know what Mexico's like. They've never been there. Many of these kids don't know Spanish, or if they know it, they'll very little of it. The parents know that Mexico isn't a safe place. There are no jobs there. They're not going to be able to go ahead and find jobs in Mexico. And so what we have is, unfortunately, the rate of child abuse and sometimes domestic violence will rise. Okay. And so we have to deal then with that other component of that. So what we try to do is to intervene. We have mental health therapists for the mom. We have it for the kids because they're different issues, and the fathers are more than welcome to come. What I've seen is a rise in the Hispanic men willing and wanting to come to therapy, which is a great thing. But I think that just gives you, it's just another level of stress for families that are contending with many barriers. So we have one more thing that they have to contend with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nicole, you had mentioned that you work with 64 organizations throughout the state, and I'm sure that's a challenge in itself. But you're also hearing a lot of the stories that happen in community from these 64 organizations. In your role there at CIRC, how do you take what's happening on the ground and help to do advocacy and policy change? Because I know that your organization does a lot of that advocacy and policy change. How does it come together to create a better ecosystem for immigrants and refugees?
So one program or initiative that we had starting in 2010 was the Campaign to Unite Colorado, where we launched a hotline for folks to be able to call in where they'd had an infraction with ICE or an incident with ICE, so we could sort of pinpoint where these things were happening across the state and take that data and really work with our sheriff departments on the bigger policy pieces. But as a result of the hotline, what we found is that across the state we were getting calls from people who were put in small local county jails and sort of like learning all of the repercussions for their families when they were put in local jail, then transferred to ICE. We would get calls weekly from people across the state, and many of our leaders of folks who can't even find their loved ones. So once they're picked up in a local jail, sometimes they're immediately put over to the detention center, and so for a period of about 8 hours, they don't know where their loved one is. And so we get a lot of calls from people across the state in that regard. One of the things that the hotline has been instrumental in doing for us is really becoming a leadership pipeline. So folks who had previously called that hotline back in 2010, 2011, 2012 are now leaders in our coalition and helping to document the cases of other people who are going through the same scenarios. So we have a leader named Mercedes in the northern region, in Boulder-Longmont area, whose husband was picked up driving to work, and as a result, their family just encountered one of the most difficult circumstances. Their income was taken away. The children were traumatized. Right now, the remaining daughters have, anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. But this woman has said, I am the documenter for Northern Colorado. I will take these calls because I don't want another family to experience what my family experienced. And so it gives me chills to sort of see how over the course of the line, we now have 150 documenters across the state who are on, being dispatched out, local phone calls from a center of the main line of the hotline, and really connecting with families across the state who are experiencing this. And I think the opportunity to educate community and to walk with them in that journey and in those really difficult moments has been just essential for our community. And then just one real quick, I know I haven't heard us talk about deferred action for childhood arrivals, but that is one program that right now so far does not look like it's up for being terminated. But one thing that we also find is that a lot of our youth that are documented, as we refer to them, there's about 70,000, is that what I thought, here in Colorado? That a lot of folks post, January were calling our local organizations, and there were folks who were talking about committing suicide, and folks who needed that urgent triage to be able to, all of a sudden these groups who are attached with advocacy, policy, civic engagement were becoming social workers and really trying to get folks pointed and connected with the right resources so that they could deal with the emotional trauma of knowing that all of a sudden they would not be allowed to work or continue to, pursue their educational dreams.
Michaela, I have one question for you. For a lot of people, it's a mystery of the process if someone gets detained to deportation. And from some folks that I talk to say it's a very inhumane process that people go through. Can you describe a little bit for us what that process looks like? And what happens from when someone's detained to being into ICE, the conditions they're in, to deportation?
Sure. So I think I'll tell the story of one of my very first clients when I first started working at Remain. And it's been really interesting when we look at the shift for the last 6 months. First of all, the Immigration Detention Center in Aurora doubled in October. So we went from a capacity of 500 people to 1,000 people, which is a huge shift, and we're hearing that there's going to be further exponential increases of detention in Colorado. But when I first started working at Remain about 14 years ago, what we saw was a lot of enforcement of longtime Colorado residents. So, and I'm sure Nicole and all the work that Cirque did, those are now your organizers, right? Those were the people who were initially getting arrested. And then about 5 years ago, it really shifted, and we saw a lot of people who were detained in Colorado who were asylum seekers, who were showing up at the southern border in Tijuana and in other areas, and then were transferred to Colorado because there was bed space here. So in Colorado, there is a multinational corporation called the GEO Group that runs a private immigration detention center here. So it's a civil detention center. And instead of, we were seeing about 2/3 of our population was brand new arrivals, no connections in Colorado, asylum seekers who had made some of the journeys that Kit described in her presentation. I mean, people fleeing from Ethiopia and taking ships to, Panama, and then journeying up through Central America, literally fleeing for their lives because of religious persecution or other grounds of persecution. So this is all a long way to answer. We've now seen that come around full circle, and we're seeing less of that population and now more enforcement of longtime Colorado residents. And I think that validates a lot of the fear that exists in the community right now, is that people are being targeted in new ways. But I'll start with the sort of full circle piece of this. I'll start with one of my very first clients that I worked with at Remain is a story of how someone ended up in immigration detention, and I think these are the stories that we're starting to see again now. So this was someone who originally from Mexico, a mother. She had 2 boys at the time who were 5 and 2, and was in Colorado Springs, had a traffic ticket, forgot to pay it, and so got a court summons to go to her traffic court ticket. And at that point, this was before CERC had done a lot of the policy work, but there was a lot more information sharing between local law enforcement and ICE. And so local law enforcement provided her information to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. She was taken into immigration detention, so without any notice for who was going to take care of her 2 little kids at the time, was brought to the Immigration Detention Center that's in Aurora, and that's where we first encountered her in our Know Your Rights presentation. She is someone who had been the victim of pretty severe domestic violence and is just an incredibly courageous, amazing woman, and had reported that victimization to law enforcement because she was really worried about the safety of her kids and also herself, and so had gone through that process. So when I met with her the first time, I was able to explain to her that there's this thing called a U visa that allows people who are victims of crime and who have helped either in the investigation or the prosecution of the crimes to be able to have this form of relief. And so ultimately she was granted a U visa. We were able to get, with the assistance of an attorney, I was able to represent her in a bond hearing. She was able to get released, but she stayed in civil immigration detention. So again, I just want to highlight this is not for people who are facing detention as some sort of criminal punishment for what they've done. This is civil detention, which exists in our country in really horrific ways. But she was in detention for about 3 months and was navigating who was taking care of her kids. The horror of being separated. My kids were, young at the same time, and just thinking about the physical separation from your baby and what that does to them and your family. Anyway, she now was granted a U visa, is now a lawful permanent resident, is actually working for Health and Human Services in Colorado Springs, helping other families who are navigating these obstacles, and just, continues to be such an inspiration. But I think that's the type of story of people that get caught up in this system, and many of them are not lucky enough to either have some form of relief, because we know that immigration law doesn't allow paths to residency or citizenship as it exists right now for a lot of people, even if they've been here for a really long time and have family members who have been here forever.
So I'm going to have you do one last comment or data point or anything you'd like to go ahead and share with the audience. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so if you can be brief, I would appreciate that. And then we're going to call up all the panelists and engage the audience with the Q&A session. So Sandra, I'll start off with you.
Well, for me, I think it was the keynote speaker statement that there is optimism in all this. I mean, we're all in the struggle. I think we all want the same thing, and that is for families to be able to live healthy and stable lives. And it looks like if we keep up the fight, maybe I won't be here to see it, but hopefully you will, and some of my staff will tell me about it. So it's exciting times at the same time.
Thank you.
I think one of the things I'd like to leave you with is just the incredible support we felt from so many, from funders, from institutions, from folks wanting to really band together in a way that was happening before, but maybe not at this scale. And so for us on the ground and our members on the ground, it's really important that we reach our families by whatever means necessary so that we can do the preventative work ahead of time, the Know Your Rights education, family emergency planning, sort of getting folks connected with mental health providers, talking about legal defense funds, all the things that we can do in advance so that we can protect our community members so they don't find themselves having to call Michaela after the fact that we have, 160,000 families to reach out there and educate. And so it's going to take all of us, and I think that we're in this moment where we can really look toward a vision of who we want to be as Coloradans. And I've said it in the past that all relief is local, and so when you watch state, legislative policy closely, you see that ending police-ICE collaboration was a local relief measure so that we would break the link between local law enforcement and immigration. When we look at driver's license, that's a first line of defense for immigrants. There's only 66,000 available for immigrants right now, unauthorized immigrants, and there's 166,000 people eligible to potentially get them. So when we look at the need for implementation and just cross sort of collaboration, there's just no better time for us to be able to rise to that challenge.
Thank you. Kayla?
Okay, I had 3 recommendations for the group. The first is ensure that Colorado remains a state where immigrants are welcome, safe, and protected. which I think we are already doing a great job, but there's still a lot of work to be done. The second one is echoing on Nicole's point, and that's the federalism argument. It's interesting that where we've always looked to the federal government to protect on immigration issues, that's really flipped with this change in administration. And there's so much that the state and localities can do, but the recommendation is to ensure that voices like Chief Wilson's voice stay strong, and that local law enforcement does not participate in 287G agreements where we're blurring the lines between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement. And then the third is to work to create a legal defense fund so that people who are caught up, particularly vulnerable populations like kids and people in immigration detention, if they are caught up in the system, they have a fair shot at accessing protections that exist under current immigration law as they navigate those very, very serious cases.
Well, help me giving them a round of applause to our panelists.